Thank you for joining today. And I am very passionate about this topic because primitive Methodist women have been hidden. The story of women within primitive Methodism sits in quite a difficult place amid a movement hailed for its progressive nature in fighting for equality and being of the working class. Women were acknowledged as useful to the movement when their presence was needed, and then all but erased from the history when they were no longer deemed a necessity. Women were employed as local and itinerant preachers in the early days of the Primitive Methodist movement, following its genesis at the camp meeting held at Malcop, Staffordshire in 1807. Female preachers were a novelty that drew crowds, and from these crowds, these women inspired converts. However, the novelty factor soon wore off. These women in men's positions went against Victorian sensibilities. It was deemed improper for women to speak so publicly. By the early 1800s, the Wesleyan Methodists had taken the hint from the rest of society. Wanting to be seen as respectable and to avoid suspicion from the British government, who were wary of working class movements in the wake of the French Revolution, they restricted women preaching. By the 1850s, the Primitive Methodists were following suit. They had built their movement, which now had many members. Hugh Bourne, who had recognised how beneficial female preachers were to the movement's growth, had died in 1852. There were now very much a chapel-based connection, and the novelty of female preachers wasn't needed anymore to harvest converts. So by the end of the 1800s, there were few female preachers. Now, women have frequently been written out of Primitive Methodist history, and it's only been in recent decades that work by E. Dorothy Graham and Dr. Jill Barber has started to put women back into the history. In 2023, when we curated Just Women at Englesea Brook Chapel and Museum, we knew we only had space to tell the stories of a small number of women. So when we conducted an audience survey to see which women's stories people would like to see, we realised there was actually a great interest in this hidden aspect of Primitive Methodist history. So we decided that a book was needed to accompany the display. And as Ruth mentioned, this necessity became more evident when a visitor commented on the lack of books for sale in our shop about women. Unfortunately, however, there are not many Primitive Methodist women who had extensive details about their lives recorded for posterity. For example, Mary Lee, a preacher with a large family, would walk 8 to 9 miles on a Sunday with her 3 youngest children to reach her preaching appointments. While the congregation sang the hymn before the sermon, she would breastfeed her baby in the pulpit so that they would sleep while she spoke. This was a story that, as the staff team at Englesea Brook, we wanted to tell. But when I tried to find further details about Lee's life, it came up blank, really. There was very little detail. The women in the booklet were selected because they itinerated to draw converts. They sailed as missionaries to distant countries among predominantly male colleagues, and they fought for social justice causes like helping those in poverty and fighting for women's rights. I also realised that I had another opportunity to tell these women's stories through talks to groups, large and small, online or in person. And today I'm going to highlight the stories of Primitive Methodist women who made their voices heard, who carved their place within the movement, and who undertook acts of Christian charity and social justice. There's much more about women in Primitive Methodism that needs and deserves to be told, but hopefully this talk, alongside the exhibition and book, goes some way to revealing their presence. Now, I'm sure many of our regulars know the answer to this question already, but to tie everything together in a coherent representation of the history, I'll just provide a brief overview of the developments of Methodism. So Methodism began in the 1700s when John Wesley, his brother Charles, and others recognised that the working class no longer felt welcomed by the Church of England, often reluctant to attend services that catered to the upper and middle classes. Wesley and others began to preach outdoors, on village greens, in market squares, so that the working class could hear the gospel message. Wesley had never intended for the Methodist movement to become a separate church from the Church of England. However, by the time of Wesley's death in 1791, the Anglican Church had become so angry at the criticism aimed at them by the Methodists that the movement split away from the Wesleyan Methodist Church. As the 1800s dawned, the British government were wary of working class groups gathering in public places, nervous that the French Revolution would inspire similar unrest in the United Kingdom. The Wesleyans therefore moved away from field preaching to chapel-based preaching. Unfortunately, the working class did not feel particularly welcome in the chapels. So in 1807, the first camp meeting was held at Malcop, organised by Hugh Bourne, William Clowes and others. This was the start of a grassroots movement that quickly spread from North Staffordshire across the country. The Wesleyans considered this outdoor preaching to be improper, resulting in Bourne being excluded from the Wesleyan connection in 1808 and Clowes dismissed by the Wesleyans in 1810. The name Primitive Methodists was first used in 1812. Excluded by the Wesleyans, it reflected a choice to follow the earlier, purer form of Methodism started by John Wesley in 1739. The phrase Primitive Methodist was even taken from one of Wesley's sermons. Like Wesley, the Prims conducted open-air worship and allowed women to preach. It has been said that Wesleyan Methodism was for the poor and Primitive Methodism was of the poor. The latter appealed to miners and mill workers, farm labourers and fishermen. Many Prims joined campaigns for workers' rights as trade union leaders and members of Parliament. The Prims also became known as ranters because of their enthusiastic preaching style. However, in 1932, the Primitive Methodists joined the Wesleyan and United Methodists in an act of union. Today, we are all part of the Methodist Church in Britain. To learn more about Primitive Methodism, Hugh Bourne and William Clowes and other inspiring Prims, come visit Englesea Brook Chapel and Museum when we reopen in April. Now on to some incredible women. And historically, women's voices have rarely been heard, and that goes for wider history, not just Methodist history. And history has for centuries been written by men, with women's stories either just not being recorded or recorded through a male perspective. Some women within the Primitive Methodist movement, however, did manage to get their voices heard. Sometimes the only information about Primitive Methodist women comes from their obituaries in the Primitive Methodist magazine, which was an annual publication. And these were frequently written by men. However, even though we may wish for a 100-page or longer autobiography about some of these women, we need to celebrate the women whose voices we are able to hear, even secondhand. And here are three of those women. Now, Temperance Frost had an extra difficulty for getting her voice heard, because this young cotton factory worker in the 1800s was born deaf and non-verbal. So she was only able to express herself through signs. And born on the 7th of January 1789 at Wirksworth in Derbyshire, she developed her own form of sign language long before British Sign Language was established. In 1820, Primitive Methodists visited Wirksworth, and Frost's mother, Hannah, opened her home for preachers to hold class meetings. A change in her manner and the way she dressed is said to have come upon Frost, who was 31 at the time. She is said to have put away all her curls and her ornament in dress, and her heart was also changed. She lost all her bad tempers and appeared fully adorned with the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. And her very soul seemed to be swallowed up of love. And it was through the Primitive Methodists that Frost was inspired to conduct public and private prayer, using her sign language to convey her message. And though she could not speak a word, yet her impressive signs and manner, her power with God through faith, and the great unction which attended her exercises had generally a very great effect on the congregation. Members of her congregations were at times brought to tears. Unfortunately, though, she didn't have a long career, and as she died of TB on the 31st of August 1821, aged 32. Up until the end, she was concerned about the souls of others, warning one young man that he would burn in hell if he didn't turn to God. There are, as well as scant details about women's history, there have often been scant details about disability in the history books, because the stories of those who have lived experience have frequently remained untold. And there was in the past the societal expectation that those with disabilities would not have public roles. However, as Frost shows, people with disabilities had a role to play in the early development of Primitive Methodism. There may have been other people with lived experience of disabilities who were influential in the Primitive Methodist movement, but so far no evidence of their stories has been uncovered. Now, some Primitive Methodist preachers were surprisingly young. One young girl gained fame at the age of 12 to 13 as a pulpit prodigy. Born on the 14th of October 1893 near Doncaster, Yorkshire, Frances Bradley Storr grew up closely connected to a Primitive Methodist chapel in Hexthorpe because her stepfather, Robert Woodhouse Storr, was the chapel's caretaker. However, it was actually her mother, Frances Storr, who had the most influence on her. The elder Frances was heavily involved in chapel life and preached in various parts of Yorkshire. Another influence on the young girl was her Sunday school teacher, whom she credits with converting her at a young age. Bradley Storr is said to have gone home following a Sunday school lesson and prayed, experiencing the great change known as conversion. The next day at school, she was eager to tell her friends that she now wholeheartedly believed that Jesus Christ was Saviour. Following her conversion, her mother allowed Bradley Storr to accompany her on preaching trips, which led to her being allowed to pray and preach from the pulpit. Crowds came to listen to her. London newspapers even sent journalists, and many credited this child with their conversion. By the time she turned 13, she had conducted worship nearly every week for over a year, holding 2 services and a children's address on Sundays. On Monday evenings, she would recount her life story, entitled My Call to Preach the Gospel, which it's quite impressive to be able to tell your life story when barely a teenager. She lived in the Doncaster area, but conducted a month-long mission to London, as well as visiting Scotland, always accompanied by her mother. She wasn't the only child preacher, and Doncaster seems to have been a centre for child preachers. Gertie Brackenbury, referred to as a girl singer, frequently travelled with Bradley Storr and her mother. And Bradley Storr's sister, Rose, was also a preacher, but doesn't seem to have gained quite as much fame. Now, one thing that we may question is the ethics of child preachers, and the presence of child preachers within Primitive Methodism raises ethical questions from a 21st century perspective. And it appears, in fact, that some people did question their use in the late 1800s and early 1900s, as the opening statement of an article by Sidney Green in the Christian Messenger suggests. Whatever criticisms may be urged against child preachers, of this there can be no question that God has used them in a wonderful manner. Green goes on to state that no one who has heard her, Bradley Storr, can have the slightest doubt as to her conversion and the remarkable spiritual gifts she possesses. Questions are raised from modern sensibilities about whether these child preachers truly had preaching gifts, whether all by the age of just 12 or 13 were fully convinced of their conversion and confident of their ability to preach about Jesus Christ as Saviour, or whether they were used simply because the originality of children preaching drew crowds. As with the use of adult women preachers, these child preachers had a novelty factor. It would have been a unique experience to see a child, especially a young girl, stood in a pulpit or at a lectern, which was the domain of men. Green acknowledged that Bradley Storr's sermons themselves do not reveal any great depth of thought, but the child has the right grip of eternal things. She had understandably not yet developed the analytical skills and theological reflection to present biblical passages that an adult preacher would have. Yet from Scotland down to London, people flocked to hear her, and she became a London newspaper favourite. Publicity photographs were taken of Bradley Storr. She appears in the Christian Messenger stood by a table, on which is lying an open Bible that she is holding with one hand, her other hand held up, palm facing outwards. Another photograph was taken of her stood in a pulpit, open Bible on the lectern in front of her, arm raised pointing towards heaven, wearing the white dress that was the wardrobe staple of most Edwardian girls. Either side of her stand Gertie Brackenbury, the girl singer, and her mother, Sister Storr. These photographs were clearly staged. While praising her skill as a preacher, the Christian Messenger does assert that she is still able to laugh, indulges in all children's games, is fond of her bicycle. In short, Frances Storr is a perfectly natural child. It is hoped that all child preachers were given opportunities to be children alongside their preaching appointments. We can also hope that they all truly wanted to preach, as we are led to believe Bradley Storr did. However, with a modern safeguarding hat on, it does raise questions and highlight a practice that appears to 21st century minds as something part and parcel of Victorian and Edwardian child labour. Now, Elizabeth Allen was from Cumberland and baptised in 1802, and she was known as Betsy throughout her life and joined the Primitive Methodist movement when still young. In 1824, she was added to a preaching plan while still in her 20s, and by October and November of the same year, she was sent to the Hull circuit. Hull was very much a strong centre of Primitive Methodism throughout the 1800s, due to the presence there of William Clowes, one of the founders of the movement. In 1825, Allen became an itinerant preacher, travelling throughout Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Staffordshire, and Cheshire. She became so popular that her meetings could go on until midnight. In 1832, she joined a mission to Ireland and went on a mission to Scotland at some point during her preaching career. The male Primitive Methodist leaders knew that the novelty of seeing this woman preach would draw the crowds they needed, which potentially explains why Allen was trusted on such missions, and why she was allowed to work so closely with the Primitive Methodist founders William Clowes and Hugh Bourne, joining Clowes on several of his preaching appointments, including on the 4th of November 1832, when she joined him to preach a special service at Burslem, Stoke-on-Trent. She became a go-to preacher for chapel openings, including at Shavington, Cheshire, where she preached alongside Hugh Bourne and his brother James. On the 17th of November 1833, she led a love feast, a sharing of worship, cake and a drink of water, at our very own Englesea Brook. However, in 1833, her preaching career slowed when she married. There was this expectation that women would stop preaching once married. And one interesting thing about Allen is the amount of comments on her clothing. And this was one obstacle that was often placed in the path of women: criticism and regulation of their clothing. The Primitive Methodist minutes instructed female preachers, travelling preachers, to be patterns of plainness in all their dress. Allen must have been a model preacher in the eyes of the male authors of the minutes, because she wore a black dress and a ranter's cap, which was a white linen bonnet with white tabs either side of the face. Whereas other women, such as Temperance Frost, were criticised for their curls and the embellishments on their clothing before they began to wear plain clothing following their conversion. Emma Quarton, in fact, after preaching at Preston Brook in Cheshire, had criticism of her clothing recorded in the minutes of the circuit meeting, and it reads as such: "In our judgment, Sister Quarton does not conform to rule in plainness of dress, with regard to her cap, watchguard, and bag. And we request her to conform in future. Resolved that T. King speak to E. Quarton respecting her superfluous dress, and the necessity of keeping her promises, and that if she do not improve, she go home." Now, I've spoken of women's voices, now for their place. And as the 1800s progressed, it became increasingly difficult for women to carve a place for themselves in the movement. Once the fear of being perceived as unrespectable took hold, the male powers that be within Primitive Methodism were worried about how the connection would be seen by society if they continued to let women preach. More barriers were placed on women, for example, using the criticism of clothing, as I've just mentioned, or expecting women to stop preaching once they were married, or at least to only preach in the Methodist circuit in which their husband lived, as a resolution of the 1827 Primitive Methodist Conference made clear. Some women, though, would not be deterred, and even travelled thousands of miles to the work God had called them to do. Now, Dorothy Ripley, I probably shouldn't have favourites, but she is one of my favourites of all the women in the book and in this talk. She was born in the Yorkshire coastal town of Whitby on the 24th of April, 1767. And she was surrounded by Methodism as the daughter of a Methodist preacher. And her childhood proved formative in other ways when she witnessed a woman being abused by a group of sailors, inspiring her to fight for the persecuted. She stated later in life, "Thou hast given me an ardent solicitude for oppression to cease, and hast filled my soul with tenderness to all who are degraded by the tyrannical power of man." Unfortunately, by the time she felt called to preach, the Wesleyan Methodist connection, of which her father had been a part, was turning against female preachers. They wanted to be seen as respectable by the rest of society, and allowing women to preach went against the sensibilities of the majority of society at that time. Ripley was eager to travel to North America as a missionary, but the Wesleyans refused. Undeterred, she went anyway as an independent evangelist. Upon arrival in the fledgling United States of America in 1802, Ripley wasted no time in getting to work fighting for the marginalized and persecuted, gaining a meeting with Thomas Jefferson, third president of the USA. Ripley arrived at the newly built White House and was met by Vice President Aaron Burr, who ushered her into Jefferson's sitting room. She expressed her shock to Jefferson about the fact that he, the president of a country so recently founded on the concept of freedom, owned slaves. Jefferson did not turn her away, but let her express her views about the need to abolish slavery and to provide slaves with education. Ripley continued to make history in Washington, D.C., becoming the first woman to preach in the House of Representatives, delivering a Sunday service in the House chamber of the Capitol building, which was still actually under construction at that time. She also travelled to the Deep South, including South Carolina and Georgia, where she preached, despite the ire she inspired in slave owners who felt threatened by the message she was spreading. Many white slaveholders cherry-picked biblical passages that they could manipulate to justify slavery. They didn't want Ripley and other missionaries to provide slaves with a more nuanced understanding of the Bible that could be used to rebel against white authority. Ripley also lived for a time among Native Americans, including the Oneida and Mohicans. She went into these communities with the traditional missionary aim of trying to assimilate Native Americans to white European modes of living. However, while living with the Oneida people in New York in 1805, she witnessed their struggle against the encroachment of white culture and white settlement on their land, the starvation this brought them, and their struggles with alcohol given to them by white traders. And she changed her aim of trying to assimilate the tribes to white culture. Now, the word missionary can often provide us with a moment of pause when reading about historic Christian missionaries. It's frequently associated with people who, claiming a divine calling, travelled to recently discovered lands to convert the native populations, who are seen as heathen and in need of civilizing Christian influence. And there is no denying that Ripley entered Native American villages with this goal of conversion in mind. However, she had her eyes opened and came to understand the culture of the Oneida and Mohicans. She witnessed their struggles to continue to exist and preserve their way of life as the white settlers of a young USA claimed the land for their own. Unfortunately, not all missionaries learned as Ripley did, but some, like Ripley, came to respect the cultures they thought they should convert. Now, in 1818, Ripley actually returned to England to help bolster and spread the Primitive Methodist movement as part of the Great Midlands Revival, accompanying American evangelist Lorenzo Dow. Dow and Ripley preached at chapel openings throughout the Midlands, including at Bingham, Nottinghamshire, where the chapel proved too small to hold the crowd. The two preachers moved outdoors to the marketplace to ensure everyone could hear them. Unfortunately, Hugh Bourne was not happy that Ripley accompanied Dow. And the reasons for Bourne's antipathy towards Ripley is unknown, but has been the cause of speculation for historians. One explanation is that Dow did not seek Bourne's permission for inviting Ripley. Another is that Bourne was upset with an unmarried woman accompanying a married man unchaperoned. I feel it's unlikely, given Bourne's support of women preachers, that he objected simply because she was a woman. That would go against everything he'd said before. However, due to Bourne never being particularly effusive in his journals, we are unlikely to ever find out his real thoughts and feelings towards Ripley. And Ripley wasn't the only female missionary to travel to the USA. Ruth Watkins travelled from Liverpool to New York City in June 1829, alongside William Knowles, William Summersides, and Thomas Morris. And unlike Ripley, who had to travel as an independent evangelist due to the Wesleyans' growing antipathy towards female missionaries, Watkins was able to travel as one of the first Primitive Methodist missionaries to the USA. Now, this group set foot on American soil on the 31st of July, 1829, and they wasted no time in beginning the work they believed God had sent them to complete. On Sunday, 9th of August, Watkins preached to a large crowd outdoors alongside William Knowles. Following this meeting, she stated, "The Lord of hosts will be with us and crown our labours with success." On Tuesday, 22nd of September, she preached at an African church to around 2,000 people. Like Dorothy Ripley, she was concerned about the treatment this marginalised community were facing. A concern she expressed to them. "I told them, I had heard of them and prayed for them, but now mine eyes saw them." Loud shouts of joy resounded through the place. 5 months into their stay in New York City, they opened a large new chapel that had room to develop as the congregation grew, and they expanded the mission to other cities. On the 28th of December, 1829, Watkins began an arduous journey from New York City to Philadelphia over dreadful roads. Throughout January 1830, she spoke regularly at meetings in Philadelphia, with crowds so eager to hear her that they struggled to fit into even the largest meeting places. On the 21st of January 1830, Watkins returned to New York, where she had a busy schedule. She preached, visited the sick and dying, including convincing one dying woman of the Lord's salvation. The group of missionaries were establishing numerous preaching places throughout the city, as well as beyond the Hudson River, including building new chapels in Newark and Bloomfield, New Jersey. Now, despite the barriers placed on women to try and prevent them having a place in Primitive Methodism in the 1800s, key acts of women helped to further the work and reach of Primitive Methodism. These women lived up to the aim of being of the working class and helping the marginalised, aims that had been part of the Primitive Methodist ethos from the start. Now, it was not, in fact, Hugh Bourne who brought Primitive Methodism to Englesea Brook, but was Cheshire woman Sarah Smith. Born on the 2nd of March, 1766, at Bartomley, Cheshire, to Thomas and Sarah Birchall, she was apparently a wayward child who would sing carnal songs, play cards, and involve herself in other species of vanity, whatever these were. Despite this behaviour, she always had an instinctive fear of God. Aged 21, she married Robert Smith of Englesea Brook, but continued card playing and reading carnal books. They never had children of their own, but they took in a young boy whom Sarah cared for like her own. When the young lad died at the age of 8, Sarah struggled to come to terms with his death, directing her anger against God. Today, we would understand that Sarah was suffering from a form of depression because she struggled to complete daily tasks, suffered from nightmares, and for 2 years was unable to sleep without holding a bundle of the child's clothes. However, around 1802, she received an invitation to a Methodist meeting and then joined a Methodist society at Betley, 2 miles from Englesea Brook. It is said that it was while a member at Betley that her soul was set at perfect liberty. Smith felt that Methodism needed to be brought to Englesea Brook. So in the summer of 1811, she invited Thomas Woodnorth to preach at her cottage, making him the first Primitive Methodist to preach in the hamlet. In 1812, Smith made the decision to leave the Wesleyan Methodist Society in Betley and joined the Primitive Methodists, who met in her cottage. Having found her way to faith in God, she wanted to help others do the same. She was very diligent to persuade all she could to come to the means of grace. She was not backwards to tell, either rich or poor, what God had done for her soul. Hugh Bourne, in fact, held Smith in high esteem, referring to her as Sister Smith, and stating that Englesea Brook became one of the supports on the infant connection. It rose into strength and flourished, and our late Sister Smith was active and industrious in the cause of the Lord. Smith used her cottage as school, although she was criticised by some for teaching the children nothing but how to pray. Bourne, in contrast, praised her for providing the children with more education than they would otherwise have received. On Sunday evenings, Smith held prayer meetings in her cottage, during which she would persuade young society members to pray and preach. And it was due to her encouragement that 6 society members became preachers. Unfortunately, on the 20th of April 1822, Smith fell down the stairs and injured the small of her back, causing her to suffer from back pain for just over 2 months. Attending her last Methodist class meeting on the 23rd of June 1822, she found herself confined to bed 3 days later, dying at the age of 56 on the 8th of July 1822. Now, Emma Caroline Davis had very strong links to Methodism from the moment she was born on the 15th of April 1859. She was born in London, just off Aldersgate Street, where 121 years previously, on 24th May 1738, John Wesley had had a conversion experience at a Moravian church meeting when he became fully convinced of salvation through Jesus Christ. Davis grew up attending a Primitive Methodist Sunday school, and her Bible class teacher, Annie Moore, noticed her talents and encouraged her in her faith. Davis later became a Sunday school teacher herself. In 1893, Reverend J. Toll-Free Parr of Surrey Chapel Central Mission on Blackfriars Road, southeast London, recognised the need for an order of Primitive Methodist laywomen to work with the poor in the area around Surrey Chapel. Parr chose the title Sisters of the People for this order and raised £25 from 25 friends to pay the first half of the yearly salary of the first sister appointed. Parr chose Davis as the first Sister of the People due to her natural compassion and experience as a Sunday school teacher. Davis worried that she wasn't well educated enough for the role, but believed that God had been calling her to work with the poor since childhood. So upon becoming Sister of the People, she chose to be known as Sister Annie, after the Bible class teacher who had so inspired her. Parr wrote of Davis, "It soon became apparent that if we had searched the kingdom through, we could not have found a sister more preeminently qualified for the hard, rough, exhausting, and even repulsive tasks she was called upon to perform." Davis served the poor in the area around Blackfriars Road, where 68% of families lived below the poverty line, many families in just one-room tenements. Her daily work involved visiting the sick, laying out the dead, and providing food and fuel for those living in poverty. As a member of the British Women's Temperance Association, Davis encouraged abstinence and helped those struggling with alcohol addiction. Davis was angered by Christians who did not realise that their priority should be helping the poor rather than preaching the gospel without doing good works. Her ministry lasted for 17 years and led to other Sisters of the People being appointed. Davis died on the 11th of March, 1911. Now, the last woman in this talk is another one of my favourites, Ethel Anakin, who has nothing to do with Star Wars. The Anakin family of Harrogate were Primitive Methodist through and through. One member of this family, Ethel Anakin, was born in 1881 and was a lifelong campaigner for several causes. While undertaking teacher training at Edgehill College, Liverpool from 1900 to 1902, she joined Pembroke Baptist Chapel, where Reverend Charles Frederick Akid preached. Akid was an advocate for social justice issues, including the promotion of teetotalism and world peace. Anakin joined Akid's work helping the poverty-stricken of Liverpool's slums. The early 1900s also saw Anakin join the campaign for women's suffrage. In 1905, she delivered lectures on socialism and women's suffrage, becoming a national speaker for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS. In 1906, she even influenced her husband, Philip Snowden, whom she'd married in 1905, to stand for women's suffrage when he was elected to Parliament. In 1908, she wrote a book entitled The Woman Socialist, which advocated that mothers should receive a state salary, as well as claiming that under socialism, women wouldn't need to wear makeup or dye their hair. She became such a vocal campaigner for women's right to vote that in 1914 she spoke at 200 meetings. The Primitive Methodist Church neglected the cause of women's suffrage. Although Anakin belonged to the NUWSS, the Society of Suffragists, not suffragettes, the Women's Social and Political Union, to which the suffragettes did belong, was dominating the headlines with acts of civil disturbance such as property damage. The NUWSS advocated more peaceful forms of protest. Despite Anakin being a suffragist and not a suffragette, the Primitive Methodist Church likely didn't want their reputation tarnished by being seen to support a cause that was so divisive at that time. The Primitive Methodist Church had also been a pacifist church before the First World War, when they supported the Allied cause and encouraged their members to do their bit for the war effort. Anakin and her husband, in contrast, continued to advocate for pacifism. The couple were actually in Canada when Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914. They planned to return to England immediately, but were advised not to due to their pacifist views. 2 years into the war, they both campaigned for a negotiated peace. In 1917, Anakin organised a women's peace crusade, speaking to 500,000 people in the final year of the war. After the First World War, Anakin was elected to the National Executive of the Women's Section of the Labour Party and the Fabian Society Executive Committee. As part of this political work, in early 1920, she was part of a joint Labour Party Trade Union Congress delegation to Bolshevik Russia, which inspired her to write a book that was highly critical of the regime of Vladimir Lenin, telling the Evening Standard, "I oppose Bolshevism because it is not socialism, it is not democracy, and it is not Christianity." In August 1920, she made another trip, this time to Georgia, as part of a delegation of representatives from Social Democratic and Labour parties from around the globe. Georgia had been part of the Russian Empire, and following the fall of the Tsarist regime in March 1917 and the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917, Georgia progressed towards full independence. The Georgians were democratic socialists who were wary of Lenin, and their socialist aims were evident. They had several political parties, universal suffrage, trade unions, and the land belonged to the peasants. Despite economic hardships that Georgia faced following wars with Turks, Armenians, and Bolsheviks, Anakin met a people full of hope and determination. They have set up the most perfect socialism in Europe. However, in February 1921, the Red Army marched into Georgia under Joseph Stalin's order, and Georgia became part of the Soviet Union. In 1931, her husband Philip was given a viscountcy, and Anakin became Viscountess Snowdon. Following her husband's death in 1937, she continued her temperance campaigns and was elected president of the Band of Hope Temperance Society. Now, thank you for listening, and I hope this has brought a few incredible women to light from the hidden depths of Primitive Methodist history.